Hello again. Good night to all of you, ladies and gentlemen around the world, from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. One of the most controversial U.S. federal government officials and cabinet secretaries of the last 2 decades has passed away. Former Defense Secretary of the United States, Donald Rumsfeld, has died of natural causes at the age of 88. What is less known is that he also served as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives and as an official of the Ford administration in the 1970s. He was born on July the 9th, 1932, and died just before his 89th birthday on June the 29th, 2021. He also served as Defense Secretary under the late U.S. President Gerald Ford from 1975 to 1977. He had another career as a businessman. His second term as United States Secretary of Defense lasted almost 6 years, from January the 20th, 2001 to December the 18th, 2006 under George W. Bush. He was both the youngest and the second oldest person to have served in the United States as Secretary of Defense. He also served as a 3-term U.S. Congressman from Illinois from 1963 to 1969, Director of the Office of Economic Opportunity from 1969 to 1970, Counselor to the President, then Richard Nixon, 1969 to 1973, the United States Permanent Representative to NATO, 1973 to 1974, and White House Chief of Staff, 1974 to 1975. Between his terms as Secretary of Defense, he served as the CEO and chairman of several companies. He was born in Chicago, Illinois, in July 1932. He attended Princeton University and graduated in 1954, majoring in political science. After serving in the U.S. Navy for 3 years, he campaigned successfully for Congress in Illinois' 13th Congressional District, winning in 1962 at the age of 30. And actually, for the U.S. representatives or congressmen or congresswomen, if I remember correctly from my reading of the U.S. Constitution, 25 is the minimum year when they can take office, and then for the U.S. senators, it's 30 years. For the U.S. presidents and vice president, it's 35 years. While in Congress, he was a leading co-sponsor of the Freedom of Information Act. Under President Richard Nixon, he served as the head of the Office of Economic Opportunity, and then also as the head of the Economic Stabilization Program before being appointed ambassador to NATO. Following Nixon's dramatic resignation in the wake of the Watergate scandal in August 1974 and Gerald Ford's accession to the presidency, Mr. Rumsfeld was called back to Washington in August 1974 and appointed Chief of Staff by President Ford. He recruited a young one-time staffer or staff member of his, Richard or Dick Cheney, to succeed him when Ford nominated him to be U.S. Defense Secretary in 1975. After Ford's presidency ended in January 1977, following his narrow loss in the November 1976 U.S. presidential election, Rumsfeld returned to private business and financial life, so in that sense he was not a career politician, and was named President and CEO of the pharmaceutical corporation GD Searle and Company. He was a member of the Republican Party. How conservative or liberal he was or moderate, I'm not sure, at least not yet. He was later named CEO of General Instrument from 1990 to 1993 and chairman of Gilead Sciences from 1997 to 2001. In January 2001, the new U.S. president at the time, fellow Republican George W. Bush, appointed him as Secretary of Defense for a second time. And most memorably, he played a central role in the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq in October 2001, launching the so-called War on Terror, which still practically is ongoing almost 20 years later, and the invasion of Iraq, which began in March 2003 and led to the overthrow of the longtime and brutal Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein in April 2003. He was then captured in December 2003 and then tried and sentenced to death by hanging for his crimes against humanity in December 2006. Before and during the Iraq War, the late Secretary Rumsfeld claimed that Iraq had an active weapons of mass destruction program, but no stockpiles were ever found. Of course, it's possible that either they were hidden very skillfully in various places, including various countries, or destroyed. The Pentagon Inspector General report found that Rumsfeld's top policy aide developed, produced, and then disseminated alternative intelligence assessments on the Iraq and Al-Qaeda relationships, which included some conclusions that were inconsistent with the consensus of the intelligence community to senior decision makers. Rumsfeld's tenure was controversial for its use of torture and the Abu Ghraib torture and prisoner abuse scandal. He gradually lost political support and resigned in December 2006. In his retirement of nearly 15 years, he published an autobiography, Known and Unknown, a memoir, as well as Rumsfeld's Rules, Leadership Lessons in Business, Politics, War, and Life. He died on June the 29th, 2021, aged 88, in Taos, New Mexico. Okay. Trying to get the pop-up window. Okay, finally closed. Rumsfeld was on his father's side of German origin. His father came from a German family that had emigrated in the 1870s from Baihe in Lower Saxony. But young Donald was sometimes teased about looking like a tough Swiss. He was an Eagle Scout and graduated from New Trier High School. He served in the U.S. Navy from 1954 to 1957 as a naval aviator and flight instructor. He was re-elected to the U.S. House of Representatives by large majorities in 1964, 1966, and 1968. However, he then resigned his seat as demanded by the U.S. Constitution because of the separation of powers, the principle that no person can be simultaneously a member of the executive or of the legislature or an executive of the executive and the judiciary or of the judiciary and legislature, let alone all these three branches. While in the parliamentary countries, such as two of the ones where I've lived, my native land Finland in Northern Europe, which is a parliamentary republic and has been since 2000, and Canada, where I lived from 1987 to 1993, members of the executive that is of the various governments or cabinets are usually also members of especially in Canada, which is a federal country, are also members of the legislature. As a congressman, he voiced concerns about the U.S. ability in the Vietnam War, criticizing then-President Johnson and his national security team for being too overconfident with how the war was being conducted. So in 1969, Rumsfeld resigned from Congress to serve in the Nixon administration. In March 1971, Nixon was recorded saying that Rumsfeld was at least tough enough and that he was ruthless. In the Ford administration, he had probably a closer and warmer personal relationship with the president, having been Ford's close friend since their joint years in the U.S. House of Representatives in the 1960s. And he actually had supported Ford's first candidacy for the U.S. House of Representatives minority leader in 1965, which was successful. He first served as the White House Chief of Staff in the Ford administration from 1974 to 1975, and in October 1975, President Gerald Ford reshuffled his cabinet, and then he was confirmed as the new defense secretary in November 1975. Interestingly enough, there was a rivalry between Secretary Rumsfeld and George Bush Sr., who became Director of Central Intelligence, at least according to the controversial American investigative journalist and writer Bob Woodward's book published in 2002, Bush at War. He claimed that Bush Sr. was convinced that Rumsfeld was pushing him out to the CIA to end his political career. At the Pentagon, Rumsfeld oversaw the transition to an all-volunteer army. In 1977, Rumsfeld was awarded the the United States' highest civilian award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In early 1977, Rumsfeld briefly lectured at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School and Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. But then he turned to business, as already described. He did, however, continue part-time public service in various posts. In November 1983, then U.S. President and fellow Republican Ronald Reagan appointed him as special envoy to the Middle East, at a turbulent time in modern Middle Eastern history when Iraq was fighting Iran in the ultimately unresolved Iran-Iraq War. He was also a senior advisor to President Reagan's panel on strategic systems, a member of the Joint Advisory Commission on U.S.-Japan Relations, and a member of the National Commission on the Public Service, interestingly from 1987 to 1990, straddling, therefore, the transition from the Reagan administration to the first Bush administration. He was also a member of the National Economic Commission and a member of the Board of Visitors of the National Defense University. Rumsfeld briefly was a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination in 1988, but withdrew from the race before the actual primaries began. During the 1996 election season, he initially formed a presidential exploratory committee, but declined to formally enter the race. Instead, he was named national chairman for the Republican nominee Bob Dole's campaign. Bush's first choice meaning Bush Jr.'s first choice for defense secretary in 2001, FedEx founder Fred Smith was unavailable, and Vice President-elect Cheney recommended Rumsfeld for the position of defense secretary. Throughout his nearly 6 years as defense secretary, he was noted for his candor and quick wit, when giving weekly press conferences or speaking with the press. He directed the planning for the war in Afghanistan after the September the 11th attacks in 2001. Before and during the Iraq War, Rumsfeld claimed, indeed, that Iraq had an active weapons of mass destruction program. President Bush was re-elected in the popular vote by a fairly narrow margin, only slightly over 3%, in November 2004, and Rumsfeld continued as defense secretary for 2 more years. Eight U.S. and other NATO member retired generals and admirals had already demanded that President George W. Bush dismiss Rumsfeld, or that he resign spontaneously in early 2006 in what was called the Generals' Revolt, accusing him of abysmal military planning and lack of strategic competence. On November the 1st, 2006, Bush still stated that he would support the continuance in office of Rumsfeld for the remainder of his presidency. He had then slightly over 2 years left of his second term. However, already on November the 6th, 2006, Rumsfeld wrote a resignation letter. And in the elections, midterm congressional elections that took place the following day, the U.S. House and Senate shifted to Democratic control, and then, of course, effective in January 2007. And after the elections were over, Bush announced that Rumsfeld would indeed resign his position as defense secretary. Many Republicans were unhappy with the delay, believing that they would have won more votes if voters had known Rumsfeld was resigning. Bush nominated Robert Gates to succeed Rumsfeld, and after Rumsfeld's confirmation by the U.S. Senate, Gates's confirmation by the U.S. Senate, Rumsfeld's resignation took effect on December the 18th, 2006. He published 2 books in retirement. In 2007, he established the Rumsfeld Foundation, which focuses on encouraging public service in the United States and supporting the growth of free political and free economic systems abroad. In June 2016, he announced that he was supporting Donald Trump for U.S. president. And on June the 29th, 2021, 10 days before his 89th birthday, Rumsfeld died from multiple myeloma at his home in Taos, New Mexico. Okay, we of course wish all the best, and especially God's abundant comfort and blessing in this season of mourning for the late Secretary Rumsfeld, for all his loved ones, friends, acquaintances, and former colleagues.